Beijing currently oversees the largest manufacturing base on the planet, fueled by an equally rapid, aggressive military expansion. But this massive industrial machine has a physical limit. Almost everything China builds and everything it consumes relies on a single maritime lifeline. This is the Strait of Malacca, the primary connection between the Indian and Pacific Oceans, wedged between the Malay Peninsula and Sumatra. Every year, a quarter of all global trade and 80% of China's oil imports flow through this corridor. At its most constricted point, the Phillips Channel, the strait narrows to just 1.7 miles wide. This geographic bottleneck means that China's survival as a global power is physically dictated by a waterway it does not control and cannot easily protect. In 2003, Chinese President Hu Jintao gave this vulnerability a name, the Malacca Dilemma. The fear in Beijing is that in a crisis, rival powers, specifically the US, Navy could simply park a fleet at the mouth of the strait and cut the country off from the rest of the world. If that 80% oil supply stops, the timeline for an economic collapse is measured in weeks, not years. Without fuel, the factories stop, the power grids fail, and the military loses its mobility. This dilemma forces China to act. As long as this vulnerability exists, every other military and economic advancement Beijing makes remains subject to a sudden external blockade. Beijing's first move was to try and replace the sea entirely by building massive overland infrastructure projects across Asia. They invested in two primary pipelines, one through Myanmar to Kunming and another starting here, at the port of Gwadar in Pakistan, designed to pump Middle Eastern oil directly into Xinjiang. But the mathematics of these pipelines are brutal. Shipping a barrel of oil by sea costs about $2. Moving that same barrel through the mountains of Pakistan costs $15. Beyond the price, pipelines lack the sheer physical capacity of a tanker fleet. They simply cannot carry the commercial volume required to sustain a country of China's size. Beijing has spent billions on these routes, but they function only as a minor insurance policy. Ultimately, the survival of the Chinese economy remains tied to the ocean. Since China cannot escape its reliance on the sea, it has pivoted to a new strategy, ensuring it has the military strength to keep those lanes open by force. This expansion includes the rapid rollout of Type 075 helicopter carriers and a Marine Corps that has tripled in size in less than a decade. To support this fleet, China is building a string of pearls, a network of overseas logistical bases, like this one at Hambantota in Sri Lanka, designed to project naval power deep into the Indian Ocean. This shift from defending trade to projecting aggressive naval force is changing the security landscape for every nation bordering these waters. China's naval buildup has not happened in a vacuum. It has triggered a unified response from rival powers intent on locking down the Malacca Strait. The United States recently signed a landmark defense pact with Indonesia, granting the U.S. military new operational access right on the strait's southern edge. Meanwhile, India is launching the $9 billion Great Nicobar project on the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, positioned at the mouth of the strait. By placing submarines, radar, and naval bases on these islands, India has effectively placed a lid on the western entrance of the waterway. These allied fortifications work together to neutralize China's string of pearls, potentially trapping the Chinese Navy behind a heavily armed multinational bottleneck. The trigger for this trap is well defined: a move against Taiwan or a major escalation in the South China Sea. In either scenario, the US and India could execute a blockade here, thousands of miles from the Chinese mainland, and effectively shut down Beijing's economy without firing a shot on Chinese soil. But a disruption of this scale would ripple through the global supply chain, turning a regional standoff into an immediate global economic crisis. 2 decades of effort have not solved the Malacca Dilemma. Instead, the resulting arms race has turned this 1.7-mile shipping lane into a volatile trigger, where a local naval clash can now paralyze the entire global economy. To keep the lights on, the modern global economy relies on forcing massive steel hulls through incredibly tight spaces, and nowhere is that squeeze tighter than the Strait of Malacca. At its narrowest point between Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia, This waterway shrinks down to a gap just 1.7 miles wide. Yet through this tiny geographic bottleneck flows roughly a quarter of all global maritime trade. For Beijing, the math here is terrifying. More than 80% of China's total oil imports, about 16 million barrels every single day, must sail through this one narrow corridor. The geography of Southeast Asia has handed the world's rising superpower a singular point of failure. In a 2003 speech, Chinese President Hu Jintao gave this exact vulnerability a name: the Malacca Dilemma. The dilemma is that China exercises absolutely no control over these waters. The strait is heavily monitored by the United States Navy, while India continues to expand military bases on island chains right at the western entrance. If a major conflict broke out over Taiwan or the South China Sea, rival navies could simply park a few warships at the edge of the strait, choke off the oil supply, and paralyze the Chinese economy within weeks. Knowing they cannot secure the water, Beijing strategists decided to buy a massive geopolitical insurance policy by carving a secure path through the land. This workaround takes the form of a multi-billion-dollar push to build overland energy networks that bypass the strait entirely. The first major effort lands in the Bay of Bengal, at the Chokepoints port in Myanmar, where heavy infrastructure has been rapidly injected right alongside local fishing villages. From this deep-water port, a pipeline pumps Middle Eastern crude directly off the ships, over the rugged mountains of Myanmar, and straight into China's Yunnan province. Once fully operational, this single overland route is designed to cover 14% of China's total domestic oil needs. 14% creates a valuable strategic buffer, but it leaves the vast majority of civilian energy imports relying on the sea. So Chinese planners looked to the other side of the Indian subcontinent, investing heavily in the Gwadar port facility in Pakistan. This proposed pipeline would take oil from the Persian Gulf, dock at Gwadar, and pipe it directly up into China's Xinjiang province, giving Indian territory a very wide berth. But pushing liquid energy across the continent requires forcing it through freezing, high-altitude mountain ranges and incredibly hostile terrain. Which brings us to the economics. This bar chart shows the baseline cost of transit. The traditional ocean route from the Persian Gulf to eastern China is highly efficient, costing roughly $2 per barrel. By comparison, punting that same barrel overland through Myanmar costs $5 to $6. Pumping it through the extreme elevations of Pakistan sends the price soaring up to $15 a barrel. As commercial ventures, these multi-billion-dollar pipelines make absolutely no sense. They are wildly inefficient. Why would the world's second-largest economy pour billions into infrastructure that operates at such a massive loss? The answer is the security premium. Beijing is willingly overpaying for every single barrel to buy geopolitical independence from the US Navy. But here is the mathematical wall they run into. Even if you max out the pressure on every overland pipe, they physically cannot absorb the 16 million barrels a day required to replace the ocean route. The pipelines are a redundancy failsafe. They ensure the military can fight and critical systems stay online during a blockade, but they cannot replace the commercial sea lanes. Because they cannot engineer their way out of the geography, Beijing has turned to a more traditional solution: a massive expansion of its blue water navy to protect the sea lanes it cannot bypass. Shipyards are rapidly pumping out power projection assets, like this massive 40,000-ton Type 075 amphibious assault ship. And they are pairing this growing fleet with a network of new overseas logistical bases, starting with a heavily fortified facility in Djibouti. The expensive overland pipelines are a geopolitical band-aid. They buy Beijing a few precious weeks of survival, while it races to build a military capable of defending its Achilles heel. 2 decades after it was named, the Malacca Dilemma remains the defining anxiety of the 21st century. Out at the far eastern edge of the Indian Ocean, nearly 1,000 miles away from the Indian mainland, sits Great Nicobar. It is one of the most remote and untouched island paradises on the planet. For centuries, its dense rainforests have been home to isolated indigenous tribes and highly specialized rare species, like the Nicobar long-tailed macaque. It is an incredibly fragile ecosystem. But right now, the Indian government is preparing to send fleets of heavy excavators to rip through 166 square kilometers of this pristine canopy. It's the start of a 72,000 crore, or roughly $9 billion mega project to build a massive transshipment port, an international airport, and a military base. The plan has triggered fierce domestic backlash. Environmentalists and opposition politicians are actively protesting the development, arguing it will permanently displace the native populations and wipe out the island's unique flora and fauna. Yet, the Indian government refuses to halt construction. To New Delhi, securing this specific piece of land, even at the cost of the sanctuary, is a matter of absolute national survival. To understand why India feels forced to do this, we have to look about 1,200 kilometers east of Great Nicobar, to the Strait of Malacca. It is the most congested and highly trafficked shipping corridor on Earth. Every year, 25 to 40% of all global trade passes through this corridor. For China, the stakes are even higher. More than 80% of its oil imports, roughly 16 million barrels a day, funnels straight from the Middle East through this specific route. Despite handling that staggering volume of traffic, the strait has a severe physical flaw. At its narrowest point, the Phillips Channel, the waterway is barely 1.7 miles wide. It is shallow, incredibly congested, and extremely easy to block. This geographic reality has terrified Beijing for decades. In 2003, Chinese President Hu Jintao gave a speech warning that malicious powers could easily choke off China's energy lifeline at this exact spot, officially coining the term the Malacca Dilemma. The world's second-largest economy relies entirely on a narrow, easily obstructed maritime choke point that it does not domestically control. To mitigate this massive vulnerability, Chinese strategists first tried to bypass the ocean entirely. They spent billions building huge overland oil and gas pipelines, cutting straight through Myanmar and Pakistan, delivering energy directly into Chinese territory. But overland routes are expensive and inefficient. Pumping oil through mountainous terrain costs significantly more than seaborne freight, and pipelines simply cannot absorb the sheer volume of commercial shipping required to keep China running. Realizing they couldn't abandon the water, China pivoted to aggressive naval power projection. The People's Liberation Army Navy began building up a massive fleet and establishing overseas logistical outposts, including a fully fledged military base in Djibouti on the Horn of Africa, to physically protect their sea lanes. Then they moved closer to India's borders. China recently secured a naval foothold on Myanmar's Coco Islands, constructing radar facilities and extending an airstrip. They placed their military presence directly on India's maritime doorstep. By desperately trying to secure its own energy lifelines from the Middle East to the Pacific, China inadvertently created a militarized string of ports surrounding the Indian Ocean, and that directly forced India to react. Which brings us back to India's Andaman and Nicobar Islands. If you look at a map, this archipelago stretches for 850 kilometers, sitting right over the western entrance of the Malacca Strait, like a lid on a boiling pot. The immediate economic logic for carrying up Great Nicobar is to build a massive transshipment hub. India wants to capture 20 to 30% of the lucrative regional cargo that currently bypasses the country and goes straight to established hubs like Singapore. The project serves a calculated military objective, an unsinkable aircraft carrier stationed exactly at China's jugular. The project includes specific, hardened military infrastructure. Indian planners are dredging deep water berths capable of supporting nuclear-powered submarines and laying down extended airstrips to rapidly deploy fighter jets and maritime surveillance aircraft. By weaponizing its exact geographic position, India gains the unilateral ability to choke off the Malacca Strait. If a conflict breaks out, India's Navy can simply deploy from their new base, blockade the 1.7-mile channel, and paralyze the Chinese economy. India isn't acting alone in this space. Recently, the United States and Indonesia signed a major defense agreement to expand military access and secure the southern edge of the strait. Great Nicobar is a vital piece in a much larger allied strategy. It creates a geopolitical pincer movement, with the US and Indonesia projecting influence from the south, locking together with India's presence from the north, effectively sealing the entire choke point to contain Chinese naval expansion in the Indo-Pacific. But establishing that strategic dominance comes with a devastating reality on the ground. The ancient forests, the isolated tribes, and the endangered macaques of Great Nicobar are directly in the crosshairs of this maneuvering. The $9 billion project forges a deliberate metal chain of deterrence across Asia's most vulnerable waterway. To the Indian government, sacrificing a priceless ecological sanctuary is a tragic but strictly necessary price to pay to ensure they are not outmaneuvered by China in the Indian Ocean. If you're enjoying the video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss our next one. Thanks for watching and supporting the channel.